In 1943, fresh meat was rationed. Butter was rationed. Sugar, coffee, cheese, all rationed. But canned food? That was the lifeline sitting on every pantry shelf, and American mothers turned 10-cent tins into meals that fed 6. Number 14 on this list was printed in a government pamphlet and handed out at post offices, but the recipe vanished when the war ended. Number 3 used a combination so strange that modern chefs refuse to believe it works until they try it. This is the part nobody talks about. Food companies did not want you to remember these recipes. If you knew that a 5-cent can of evaporated milk could replace $1's worth of groceries, you would never buy half the products on a modern supermarket shelf. Before we start, hit that subscribe button, because what you are about to learn fed an entire generation through the worst years of the 20th century. Let us count down the 25 forgotten poor man canned food meals from World War II. Number 25, canned corned beef hash patties. Every kitchen in wartime America had a tin of corned beef hash sitting in the cupboard. Not the fancy kind. The cheap stuff, broadcast brand or Armor, maybe 12 cents a can in 1943. Mothers would open the tin, dump the hash onto a cutting board, and slice it into thick rounds about ½ an inch wide. Those rounds went straight into a hot skillet with a spoonful of saved bacon grease. They were fried until the edges turned dark brown and crispy, and often served with a fried egg on top if you had the ration points to spare. The outside crackled when you bit into it. The inside stayed soft and salty. Children dragged bread through the runny yolk and called it supper. A single can fed 3 people, sometimes 4 if the bread was thick enough. When fresh beef cost 38 cents a pound and required red ration stamps, a tin of hash was the meal that asked nothing but a hot pan and 5 minutes. Families ate this 3 nights a week without complaint because the alternative was going without. Number 24, creamed chipped beef on toast. Soldiers called it by a name we cannot say on this channel, but their mothers served it at home with quiet pride. A jar of dried chipped beef cost about 15 cents. You would tear the salty, paper-thin slices into pieces, soak them in warm water to draw out the brine, then stir them into a white sauce made from canned, evaporated milk, flour, and a tablespoon of butter. Poured over toast, it was breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on the day. The sauce was thick and peppery, the beef chewy and intensely savory. Military mess halls served it by the ton, and wives learned to make it at home because the ingredients required almost no ration points. 2 slices of bread, a jar of beef, a can of milk. That was dinner for 4. Some mothers added canned peas for color, others stirred in a spoonful of mustard for bite. Nobody wrote these variations down. They just did it because hunger does not wait for a recipe book. Number 23, canned salmon croquettes. A 1-pound tin of pink salmon cost about 23 cents during the war, and it became the Friday night staple in households across America. Mothers drained the fish, picked out the bones, though some left them in for calcium, and mixed the flaked salmon with crushed saltine crackers, a beaten egg, and diced onion. They shaped the mixture into oval patties and fried them in whatever fat was available. The croquettes came out golden and crispy, with a tender, flaky center. They were often served with canned peas and mashed potatoes made from dehydrated flakes. The whole meal cost less than 35 cents and fed 5. The kitchen smelled like the sea for hours afterward. Children who grew up during the war still remember that smell 60 years later, and the sound of those patties sizzling in the cast iron pan their grandmother never washed with soap. Number 22, Spam and egg scramble. Hormel introduced Spam in 1937, but it was the war that turned it into a household name. By 1944, over 150 million pounds of Spam shipped to Allied forces overseas. At home, a 12-ounce tin cost around 32 cents, and mothers stretched it into breakfast for the whole family. They cubed the meat into small pieces and fried it until the edges browned and became slightly crisp. Then they scrambled it with whatever eggs were available. Sometimes there were 2 eggs for 5 people, with the Spam doing the heavy lifting. The salty pork and the soft eggs together created something that tasted far better than it had any right to. Ketchup on top, if you had it. A slice of toast on the side. Nobody complained. You ate what was put in front of you because Dad was in the Pacific and Mom was working the swing shift at the factory. Number 21. Mock apple pie. This is the one that breaks people's brains. During the war, when fresh apples were expensive or unavailable in cities, housewives made apple pie without a single apple. They used Ritz crackers. The recipe was printed right on the back of the box. Crushed Ritz crackers soaked in sugar water with lemon juice, cream of tartar, and cinnamon were baked in a pie crust. The result tasted so convincingly like apple pie that husbands could not tell the difference. The cream of tartar created an acidic tang that mimicked green apples. The crackers broke down into a texture almost identical to cooked fruit. It sounds impossible. It is not. Nabisco kept this recipe on their box for decades because it worked. It was Depression-era ingenuity carried straight into the war years, and families who could not afford fruit still served pie on Sunday. Number 20. Canned bean and bacon soup casserole. Campbell's bean with bacon soup was not just soup during the war. It was a sauce, a gravy, and a casserole base, all in one. Mothers poured the condensed soup over sliced hot dogs arranged in a baking dish, topped it with canned baked beans, and baked the whole thing until it bubbled. It baked for 25 minutes. The hot dogs plumped in the thick bean sauce. The edges caramelized, dark and sticky. Served with cornbread made from Jiffy Mix or plain white bread to soak up the sauce. A can of soup, a pack of Franks, a can of beans. Total cost under 40 cents. Total time under 30 minutes. A family of 6 went to bed full. That is what mattered. Number 19. Canned tuna noodle bake. Before tuna casserole became a 1950s cliché, it was a wartime survival meal. It started with a can of tuna, about 18 cents, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and cooked egg noodles, mixed together in a baking dish, topped with crushed potato chips or crumbled crackers, and baked until golden. The mushroom soup acted as a ready-made sauce, eliminating the need for butter, flour, and milk, all of which were rationed. The potato chip topping was a trick that appeared in community cookbooks across the Midwest. It added crunch and salt without extra butter. Children ate it without argument because it tasted like comfort. Mothers made it because it required almost no skill and almost no ration points. This is the dish that taught America that a can of condensed soup could replace an entire cooking technique. The government told Americans to grow their own food, and by 1944, 20 million victory gardens produced roughly 40% of all vegetables consumed in the country. When the harvest came in too fast to eat fresh, mothers canned everything. Tomatoes, green beans, corn, carrots, all went into mason jars. Come winter, those jars became soup. A quart of home canned tomatoes, a pint of green beans, some canned corn, diced potatoes, and a ham bone saved from Sunday dinner. They were simmered for hours on the back burner. No recipe, just whatever was on the shelf. Every pot tasted different. Every pot tasted like home. The soup stretched across 2 or 3 dinners, reheated each night, getting thicker and richer. Waste was not just frowned upon, It was considered unpatriotic. Number 17, canned deviled ham sandwiches. Underwood deviled ham in that little red tin with the devil on the label. Mothers spread it on white bread with a thin layer of mayonnaise and a leaf of iceberg lettuce if they had it. That was lunch. Quick, cheap, no cooking required. A tin cost about 10 cents and made 4 sandwiches. The paste was salty, peppery, and intensely meaty, with a texture somewhere between pâté and potted meat. Children carried these sandwiches to school wrapped in waxed paper, trading them at lunch tables across America. Some mothers mixed the deviled ham with cream cheese to stretch it further, spreading it thin on crackers for an afternoon snack. It was not glamorous. It was not even particularly good by modern standards, but it was protein, and in 1943, protein was precious. Number 16, canned pork and beans with brown bread, B&M. Brown bread in a can was a New England staple that spread across the country during the war. It was a cylinder of dense, sweet, molasses dark bread that slid out of the tin in one piece, sliced into rounds, and served alongside a pot of canned pork and beans, maybe Van Camp's or Campbell's, heated on the stove with a spoonful of mustard and a drizzle of molasses stirred in. Saturday night beans and brown bread. The tradition went back generations in Boston, but the war made it national because canned bread and canned beans required 0 ration points. The bread was moist and slightly sticky, the beans thick and sweet. A meal that cost less than a quarter and needed nothing but a pot and a can opener. Some families added sliced hot dogs to the beans. Others topped the bread with a pat of margarine. Either way, Saturday supper was settled. Number 15, canned peach cobbler. When sugar was rationed to ½ a pound per person per week, dessert became a challenge. But canned peaches came packed in heavy syrup, which meant the sweetener was already built in. Mothers poured a can of sliced peaches and their syrup into a baking dish, mixed a simple batter of flour, a little sugar, milk, and melted margarine, and poured it right over the top. As it baked, the batter rose around the fruit, forming a golden crust while the peaches sank into pockets of sweet, bubbling syrup. A can of peaches cost about 15 cents. The batter ingredients were pantry staples. The result tasted like a proper bakery dessert. Served warm, with a spoonful of canned evaporated milk poured over the top as a stand-in for cream. Children scraped their bowls. Mothers smiled. Dessert for a dime. Number 14, soybean loaf. This is one most people have never heard of. The USDA printed pamphlets during the war, encouraging housewives to cook with soybeans as a meat substitute. One recipe called for canned soybeans, mashed with breadcrumbs, grated onion, canned tomato sauce, and a beaten egg, shaped into a loaf and baked. It was dense, savory, and surprisingly filling. The government promoted it as patriotic. Eat less meat, so the troops could eat more. The pamphlets were distributed at post offices and ration board offices. Most women tried it once. Some adopted it permanently. The loaf held together when sliced, browned nicely on the outside, and absorbed gravy like a sponge. Served with mashed potatoes and canned green beans, it passed for a real meal. After the war, the recipe disappeared completely. Soy went back to animal feed. Meat came back to the table. Nobody spoke of the soybean loaf again. Number 13, canned mackerel cakes. Salmon was popular, but canned mackerel was cheaper. A tall tin cost about 15 cents. Mothers mixed the flaked fish with mashed potatoes, a beaten egg, minced onion, and a dash of Worcestershire sauce. They were formed into flat cakes, then fried in a thin layer of fat. The mackerel had a stronger, oilier flavor than salmon, and some children refused it outright. But the cakes were filling and rich in protein. They were served with canned stewed tomatoes poured over the top as a sauce. The acid from the tomatoes cut through the oiliness of the fish, and the whole plate came together in a way that worked better than it sounded. Mothers who served mackerel cakes during the war rarely mentioned them afterward. It was a meal born of necessity, not nostalgia. Number 12. Canned chili over spaghetti. In Cincinnati, this combination became a regional institution, but during the war it spread far beyond Ohio. A can of Hormel chili cost about 20 cents, heated and poured over boiled spaghetti noodles, topped with whatever cheese was available, maybe a few shavings from a rationed block of American cheese. The noodles stretched the chili into a full meal. The cheese melted into the sauce, adding richness. Some mothers added canned kidney beans to bulk it further. Others diced a raw onion over the top for crunch. The whole plate cost less than 30 cents and required one pot and one can opener. It was the kind of meal nobody would ever put in a cookbook, but every family remembers eating it at least once a week. Number 11. Canned sardines on crackers. The simplest meal on this list, and maybe the most common. A tin of sardines packed in oil or mustard sauce, laid out on saltine crackers, eaten standing at the kitchen counter. There was no cooking. There was no preparation beyond pulling the key and rolling back the lid. Sardines cost around 8 cents a tin. They were packed with protein, calcium, and omega fatty acids, though nobody called them that in 1943. Mothers ate this for lunch while the children were at school. Fathers ate it when they came home from the factory, too tired to wait for supper. It was sustenance, stripped down to its most basic form. A meal that admitted it was only fuel and did not pretend to be anything else. Yet the taste of those sardines, oily and briny and sharp, embedded itself in memory like few wartime foods could. Number 10. Canned tomato soup cake. This sounds wrong. It is not. Campbell's tomato soup, stirred directly into cake batter, produced a moist, spiced cake that stayed fresh for days. The recipe appeared in community cookbooks and newspaper food columns throughout the war. One can of condensed tomato soup replaced the eggs and some of the fat. The acidity activated the baking soda, giving the cake a tender crumb. It was spiced with cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, and then topped with cream cheese frosting if you could manage it, or just dusted with powdered sugar. Nobody could identify the tomato. It simply tasted like a rich spice cake. Mothers served it at church socials without revealing the secret ingredient. It became one of the most requested recipes of the decade, and then it vanished. Modern bakers rediscover it every few years and react with disbelief. But grandmothers knew. The soup made the cake better than eggs ever could. Number 9. Canned corned beef and cabbage. Irish-American families had been making this for generations, but during the war it became universal. A tin of corned beef shredded with a fork, simmered in a pot with wedges of cabbage, quartered potatoes, and sliced carrots. The canned beef broke apart into salty, tender strands that flavored the entire pot. The cabbage went sweet and soft. The potatoes absorbed the brine. One can, a few vegetables from the garden or the root cellar, and you had a one-pot dinner for 5. No ration points needed for the vegetables, 12 points for the corned beef. Mothers budgeted those points carefully, knowing this meal would carry the family through a Tuesday night without complaint. Number 8. Canned pineapple upside-down cake. Dole canned pineapple rings were one of the few luxuries that did not require ration stamps. Mothers arranged the rings in the bottom of a cast-iron skillet, dropped a maraschino cherry into each center, poured brown sugar and melted margarine over the top, then covered it with a simple yellow cake batter. It was baked until the top was golden, and the bottom turned into a sticky, caramelized glaze. Flipped onto a plate, it looked like something from a bakery window. The cake cost less than 40 cents to make. It appeared at potlucks, church suppers, birthday parties, and Sunday dinners. Children stared at the glistening rings and fought over the cherries. This was the dessert that proved wartime cooking did not have to taste like sacrifice. Number 7. Canned Vienna sausage and rice. A small tin of Vienna sausages cost about a dime. Sliced in half lengthwise and browned in a pan, then stirred into cooked white rice with a can of cream of celery soup and a handful of canned peas. The whole thing went into a baking dish for 15 minutes until the top dried slightly and the edges turned golden. The sausages were soft, salty, and mild. The rice absorbed the creamy soup. The peas added the only color on the plate. It was bland by any honest measure, but it was warm and it was filling, and it stretched 10 cents worth of sausage into dinner for 4. Mothers all over the South made variations of this dish, some adding canned mushrooms, others stirring in a spoonful of yellow mustard for sharpness. Number 6. Canned evaporated milk fudge. When fresh milk was scarce and cream was a memory, canned evaporated milk became the backbone of wartime desserts. Mothers made fudge by combining evaporated milk with sugar and cocoa powder, boiling it to the soft ball stage, then beating it until thick and glossy. They poured it into a buttered pan and cut it into squares. The evaporated milk gave the fudge a creamy caramel undertone that regular milk could not match. A batch cost less than 20 cents and made enough to fill a candy dish for the week. Children came home from school to find squares wrapped in waxed paper tucked into their lunch pails. It was the small luxury that made rationing bearable. Something sweet when everything else tasted like sacrifice. Number 5. Canned baked bean sandwiches. This one divides people. Open a can of pork and beans, mash them slightly with a fork, spread them on white bread like you would peanut butter. Some mothers added a drizzle of ketchup or a few slices of raw onion. Others mashed in a spoonful of yellow mustard. The sandwich was eaten cold, packed in lunch boxes for factory shifts and school days. It sounds crude, and it was, but a can of beans cost 8 cents, and a loaf of bread was about 10 cents. That was lunch for the entire family for 2 days. The beans provided protein and fiber. The bread provided bulk. Nobody pretended this was fine dining. It was survival food that tasted good enough to eat without grimacing, and that was the only standard that mattered during the war. Number 4. Canned Milnot whipped topping. When cream disappeared from store shelves, Milnot, a filled evaporated milk product, stepped in. Chilled until ice cold and whipped with a hand beater, it turned into stiff, sweet peaks that could top pies, fruit salad, and gelatin molds. A can cost about 12 cents and produced enough whipped topping for 2 desserts. The trick was getting it cold enough. Mothers set the can in the icebox overnight, sometimes burying it in snow during winter. Whipped fast, it held its shape for hours. Sweetened with a teaspoon of sugar and a drop of vanilla extract, it tasted close enough to real whipped cream that children never questioned it. When the war ended and cream came back, Milnot quietly disappeared from most kitchens. But for 4 years, it was the reason America still had PIE. Number 3. Canned tomato and peanut butter soup. Here is the one that sounds like a mistake. It is not a mistake. Housewives stirred 2 tablespoons of peanut butter into a pot of heated Campbell's tomato soup. The peanut butter melted into the soup, creating a creamy, slightly nutty, protein-rich bowl that tasted nothing like what you are imagining. The fat from the peanut butter rounded out the acidity of the tomatoes, and the protein turned a thin cup of soup into a genuine meal. This combination appeared in wartime nutrition guides published by home economics departments at state universities. The science is sound. The peanut proteins and tomato acids create a flavor compound that registers as rich and savory, almost meaty. Children who would not eat plain tomato soup cleaned their bowls when peanut butter was stirred in. After the war, this recipe vanished so completely that when it resurfaces online, people treat it as a hoax. It is not a hoax. It fed thousands of families, and it works. Number 2, canned condensed milk caramel. Take an unopened can of sweetened condensed milk. Submerge it in a pot of boiling water. Simmer for 3 hours. Open it carefully. Inside, the milk has transformed into thick, golden dulce de leche, a caramel so rich and smooth it tastes like something that belongs in a French patisserie. Mothers spread it on bread, spooned it over canned fruit, used it as pie filling, and let children eat it straight from the can with a spoon. The recipe came from Latin America but spread through American kitchens during the war because sweetened, condensed milk was cheap and available. 1 can, 1 pot of water, 3 hours of patience. The result was the most luxurious thing that came out of a wartime kitchen. It cost about 14 cents and lasted a week. Some families still make it this way. Most have forgotten that 3 hours and a can of milk is all it takes to make caramel from nothing. Number 1, canned everything stew. This is the meal that defined wartime America. No recipe, no rules, just whatever cans were in the pantry, opened and poured into one pot. A can of mixed vegetables, a can of tomato soup, a can of potatoes, maybe a can of corned beef, or Vienna sausages torn into pieces, a splash of water, salt and pepper, simmered until it all came together into a thick, brownish, nameless stew that tasted like Tuesday night in 1944. Every family made it. No 2 pots were the same. Children did not ask what was in it. Mothers did not explain. The pot sat on the stove, stretching across 2 nights, sometimes 3, reheated until the edges of the pot turned dark and sticky. It was ugly. It was filling. It was the taste of a country holding on until the boys came home. Nobody put it in a cookbook because nobody needed to. You opened what you had, you cooked it until it was hot, and you fed your family. That was the recipe. These 25 meals were not elegant. They were not Instagram-worthy. They were the food that kept America standing during the darkest years of the 20th century. Canned corned beef, condensed soup, evaporated milk, and 10-cent tins of sardines. That was the arsenal of the American kitchen. Mothers who had never heard the word nutrition kept families fed on instinct and ingenuity. They stretched cans into casseroles, turned soup into cake, and made caramel from a pot of boiling water. And when the war ended, we forgot all of it. Food companies told us we needed their new products. Supermarkets told us fresh was the only way. The recipes that kept a generation alive disappeared into the backs of kitchen drawers, scribbled on index cards that nobody ever read again. Try one of them this week: the tomato soup cake, the peanut butter soup, the boiled can of condensed milk. Then come back and tell me your grandmother did not know exactly what she was doing.